All right, we're doing the book of Nehemiah today, and as you can see, I've given you an introduction to Nehemiah handout. The gap between the book of Ezra, which we last were looking at, and the book of Nehemiah is approximately 12 years. Now, that's not really quite the right way to put it, because we don't know how long Ezra remained. We know when he went to Jerusalem from Babylon, or from Persia, and that was in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. Nehemiah begins in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, so 13 years later. Now, Ezra's reforms, we assume, took something maybe like a year or so, and therefore we would say the gap between the close of the book of Ezra and the opening of Nehemiah would be about 12 years. And we will find that Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem initially for 12 years. He stays in Jerusalem for 12 years, and then he goes back to Persia for an ungiven amount of time. It may have only been a few months or years. And then he came back to Jerusalem, and that's where we have him at the end of the book. So Ezra and Nehemiah were both used in similar ways to help restore the polity and the religious purity of the Jewish community. They had come back under Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest in the earlier part of Ezra, in Ezra chapters 1 through 6. And they had, some population had come back, about 50,000 Jews had come back with Zerubbabel. Later, Ezra brought a few thousand more with him, probably about 5,000 total or less. And then Nehemiah comes back, mostly, not with a large group, but probably some more came with him. Now, when Ezra and Nehemiah came, they came at different times with a concern to help the Jewish community reestablish themselves on their original foundations under the Mosaic law. The Jews who had come back from Persia or Babylon in the time of Zerubbabel had become very lax, and we find that Ezra was very concerned that there was intermarriage between the Jews and the pagan women, so that, of course, there was a reduction in the integrity of their culture and of their religion as well. And so Ezra grieved, and he basically brought about some reforms in that area. They actually divorced their pagan wives in the time of Ezra. And Ezra continued to work in the community, though we don't have record of what Ezra did. In fact, we have no more record of what Ezra did at all, except for in Nehemiah chapter 8, where Ezra reappears alongside Nehemiah in Jerusalem at a ceremony of reading the law at the Feast of Tabernacles. So we are not finished with Ezra completely, but the focus now turns to another man of a very different sort. Ezra was a priest and a scribe. That means he was a clergyman in Israel's religion. He was of the priestly caste, but he didn't serve so much as a priest as of a scribe, an expert in the law. That's what Ezra did. Nehemiah was a layman. He was not a priest. He was probably of the tribe of Judah, and he was not an expert at the law. He was just a hands-on kind of a guy who saw something that needed to be done and did it. And in that respect, Nehemiah is more like perhaps the rest of us. We are not clergy. We're not trained or ordained clergy people. We are laymen. But Nehemiah accomplished a great deal as a zealous layman for God. And this is perhaps one of the values of the book, to show us he was not at all unspiritual. Though he was not a religious person in the sense of having religious credentials. He was a spiritual man and a practical man. And the story goes like this. Now, the name Nehemiah means God, Yahweh comforts. He was one of the captives in Persia after the Babylonian Empire fell to Persia, and had been a captive in Babylon, apparently raised there. Somehow, unknown to us and unrelated, he had become the cupbearer in the court of the Persian king, Artaxerxes I. Now, cupbearer in the King James Version was called the butler. When back in Genesis, when Joseph was in prison, he encountered a cupbearer, a butler in prison, the Pharaoh's butler. So the King James uses the term butler. It's in Genesis 41, verses, just 41, and actually chapter 40 and 41 in Genesis talk about this man. He was put in prison with Joseph. Joseph interpreted his dreams, and the man later was restored to power. And it was through this cupbearer that Joseph himself was brought to the attention of Pharaoh, because Pharaoh had a dream, and the cupbearer remembered that Joseph had been able to interpret his dream. And so Joseph was called from prison, and because of this cupbearer, Joseph was not only released, but elevated to high position. Now, the cupbearer was actually, it's a shame that it's translated butler in the King James. We might even think of it, even if we didn't have the word butler attached to it, that somebody who just brings a cup to the king is, that's not a very important position. Maybe a low servant. But actually the opposite is true. It was the most trusted position of service to the king. The cupbearer was the one who tasted the wine to make sure it wasn't poisoned, so that the king could safely drink it. There were many times people would try to kill kings, and poisoning was a very easy way to do it, and so kings had cupbearers who would taste their wine in their presence before they would serve it to them. And therefore the cupbearer was a person who put his life on the line for the king. If someone wanted to poison the king, the cupbearer would poison himself first and save the king. And it was a very lofty position. It's not a position given to somebody who was perhaps expendable and thought, well, let him die. But rather, it's a position of authority. And we can see that the cupbearer in Pharaoh's court was influential in bringing Joseph out of prison. Rabshakeh, who was the one who negotiated with Hezekiah's men outside the walls of Jerusalem when Sennacherib sent his armies to Jerusalem. The Rabshakeh was the man who, called out to the people on the wall and said, "Don't let Hezekiah deceive you. Yahweh is not going to save you. Yahweh hasn't saved. The gods of these other nations have not saved them from me. What makes you think that Yahweh will save you?" That man, that blasphemer, that Rabshakeh. The word Rabshakeh means cupbearer. He was the chief cupbearer to Sennacherib, the king of Assyria at the time. And you can see that Rabshakeh was a very influential man. He was leading the armies. So a cupbearer was an influential and powerful position, a privileged position, and given to someone that the king trusted a great deal. And also was probably a comfortable life, probably an opulent life. He was at a high position in the king's court. So he was in a comfortable place in Persia at this time, in Shushan, which is the name of the capital mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. Now Shushan is better known as Susa. Susa was one of 4 Assyrian capitals. There were 4 cities that the Assyrians used as capitals. Shushan was the winter capital, apparently because it was a warmer place. Ecbatana was the summer capital. And there were other capitals too. But it says Shushan here in 1:1, and we should understand that's a reference to Susa. So that's a Persian capital, and he is in the court of Artaxerxes I as cupbearer. Now, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, which is about 444 or 445 BC, he received permission from the king to return to Jerusalem and assist the struggling Jews, especially with reference to their defenses. They had been, by this time, something like 80 years or so in Jerusalem, but their walls and gates were dilapidated. Now, this was either the original condition from the time that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed them, and they had never been restored in that long period of time that the Jews had been back, simply because the rubble was too formidable and too large a task and no one took it on. Or else they had begun to build the walls, and we find that they did in Ezra chapter 4. They'd begun to build the walls, but their enemies had written to King Artaxerxes, as a matter of fact, and had accused them of planning a revolt against him. And Artaxerxes had actually written a letter back, which is found in Ezra chapter 4, saying that the Jews must cease and desist in their working on the wall and on the building of the city until he would say otherwise. And that's how things stood. So either the walls were still very dilapidated and had not gotten very far in rebuilding, or else they had been built somewhat and the enemies had re-damaged them by various attacks. We know that they did come under some kinds of attacks. Nothing like a whole war, between two armies. But we are told that there were various kinds of attacks and harassments that their enemies brought against them. So when Nehemiah was commissioned to go, he was to go especially to help build the walls. That was his main concern. Like I said, Ezra and Nehemiah were different in that Ezra was a priest. He was a clergyman. Nehemiah was a layman. He was a man who just had a government position. For some reason, we don't know how he rose to that position in Assyria, but the Assyrians were pretty generous to the Jews and gave them positions from time to time. We know that Daniel had a position in the reign of Darius and Cyrus also. He was made to be like the governor. The king made him the governor of the city of Jerusalem. And this was in conflict with a man who had already seen himself as in charge of that region. That's Sanballat. And so he's going to have some conflicts with this man Sanballat, who saw himself as the one having jurisdiction, yet now King Artaxerxes had given Nehemiah that jurisdiction. And in this sense, Nehemiah is a little bit like Jesus, in that Jesus left a comfortable position to go down and to associate with the plight of his people. And he took on himself the form of a servant and suffered. And Nehemiah came to suffer with the people of God. Moses had done the same thing. It says of Moses in chapter 11 of Hebrews that he left Pharaoh's household in order to suffer reproach with the people of God. Moses had done this, left the king's mansion to suffer. Nehemiah did that. Jesus did that. This is a theme that we find repeatedly among many of the great leaders in Israel's history, and of course the Messiah himself. So they actually rebuilt the walls in about 52 days' time. But then there was more work to be done, because there was not only external enemies, but internally the nation had its problems. There were some Jews oppressing other Jews. There were compromises of a very dangerous sort in the community, and so Nehemiah took charge of those things. And after about 12 years of governing there, he went back to Susa, apparently to report back to the king, and then after some interval, we don't know how long, he came back to Jerusalem and remained there till the end of the book at least, maybe the rest of his life. And there he reinforced some of the issues that had become lax again in the community. It seems like these people were very poor at holding to their commitments. They would commit under Ezra and even under Nehemiah to not break the Sabbath and to not intermarry with the pagans and to not do these things, and then they'd do them again as soon as Nehemiah was gone. So Nehemiah had to clean house again at the end when he came back. Now the authorship of the book, one might immediately think of it as Nehemiah as the author because there's so much of it written in the first person. Nehemiah does write much of the book, although the Jews' tradition was that Ezra was the real compiler of this book. Actually, Ezra and Nehemiah was one book in the Jewish Bible. And it was believed, along with Chronicles, to have been written by Ezra. Obviously, Ezra would have used the memoirs of Nehemiah, which have Nehemiah's own words, in many of the chapters. There are a few of the chapters that are narrated not in the first person and may be brought in by Ezra from some other sources. But it's clear that the memoirs of Nehemiah himself are among the main sources of the work. But it's probable, or at least I don't know if I should say it's probable, but it's at least traditional among the Jews that Nehemiah was written by Ezra, as was the book of Ezra for the most part. Now the date of writing is unknown, of course, but the last recorded event in it would be probably around 425 BC, so obviously it wasn't written before then. So it was written, therefore, probably around the same time that Malachi was written. Malachi was written sometime, well, Malachi the prophet was probably contemporary with Nehemiah It's not clear because Malachi doesn't give any real indicators of what the time period is, except we do know that Malachi wrote after the temple had been rebuilt. And, he was living in the community of the exiles who had returned to Jerusalem. And he seems to be living later than Zechariah and Haggai. But we don't have any exact dates for Malachi, but many think that he could have been contemporary with Nehemiah because some of the issues that Malachi talks about, is concerned about, are similar or identical to the issues that are mentioned in Nehemiah's time. So probably sometime between 425 and 400 BC is when Nehemiah would have been written. We don't know how long Ezra lived, but we know that he'd be a very old man if it was written much later than that. I might add that Nehemiah's time was contemporary with that of Socrates in Greece, in Athens. Socrates was living at the time of Nehemiah, and only a couple of decades earlier, Buddha in India had lived. So these are some of the things that were going on around the world besides Israel. West of Israel, we have Socrates. East of Israel, we have Buddha, influential. And right there in the Middle East, we have, of course, Nehemiah restoring the law of Moses. So things that set in motion other culturally important things elsewhere in the world were happening also at this time. And the restoration of a pure Jewish community in Jerusalem was not insignificant in the Middle East, obviously. There's probably legitimacy in finding in Nehemiah some typology of the building of the church. The building of the walls of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a type of the church in the Old Testament, and even its walls appear to be. We have in Isaiah 60 a passage which almost all scholars would agree has reference to the church. Perhaps dispensationalists would not. They might take this to be about the millennium. But throughout most of history, this chapter has been thought to be about the church. And in talking about it, it says this in verse 10, Isaiah 60:10, "The sons of foreigners shall build up your walls, and their kings shall minister to you. For in my wrath I struck you, but in my favor I have had mercy on you. Therefore your gates shall be open continually, they shall not be shut day or night, that men may bring to you the wealth of the Gentiles and their kings in possession. For the nation and kingdom which will not serve you shall perish, and those nations shall be utterly ruined." Then it goes on and talks about some more of the nations, what they will bring and how they will honor this. But you see, it says, "Sons of foreigners shall build up your walls." The walls of the church are spiritual walls, of course, and later on, it actually says that in verse 18, Isaiah 60:18, "Violence shall no longer be heard in your land, neither wasting nor destruction within your borders, but you shall call your walls salvation, and your gates praise." And there's more in this chapter that actually connects with the description of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21. In fact, Revelation 21's description of the New Jerusalem is taken almost entirely from Isaiah 60. And it's hard to deny that the New Jerusalem is the church, since John in Revelation 21 and verse 9 is told, "Come and I will show you the Lamb's bride, the Lamb's wife," which would be, of course, the church, the bride of Christ. And he says, "He took me to a high mountain and he showed me the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven." Earlier in chapter 21, he says, "I saw the New Jerusalem coming down adorned as a bride for her husband." The New Jerusalem is the bride of Christ, the church. And it is described in Revelation 21, but that description is taken almost entirely from Isaiah 60. So it's fair to suggest that Isaiah 60 refers to the church, and that the references to gates and so forth are references to spiritual gates. In fact, your walls should be called salvation. Your gates should be called praise. Obviously, salvation and praise are spiritual things, not physical things. So I think it's fair to assume we're looking at something that is to be spiritualized. if you look at Isaiah chapter 58, Isaiah chapter 58 is talking about how the Jews had been fasting, and yet they complain that God has not responded to their fasting. And so God tells the prophet, tell these people that their fasting has not impressed me. I never asked them to bow their heads like a bulrush and to wear sackcloth and to fast like this. What I want them to do is to fast from their evil, fast from their sins, fast from their oppressing their servants and so forth. In other words, be righteous people. God's not so concerned about how many meals they would miss, but how many sins they would repent of and cease to commit. And in telling them how he wants them to do that, he talks then about the glory that they will know if they do this. He says in verse 8, then your light shall break forth like the morning, your healing shall spring forth speedily, your righteousness shall go before you, the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. But then look at verse 12. Those from among you shall build the old waste places. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations, and you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. Now, this is saying that those who are righteous will be instrumental in restoring the breach, meaning the breaks in the wall. That they will be those who raise up the old waste places. Now that's what Nehemiah was doing. And so it would seem that Nehemiah's rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, like many other historical events in the Old Testament, can be seen as a type of our spiritual activity of seeking to restore the church, to build it up. Each person in the church is a living stone being built up into a spiritual house. Now that imagery from 1 Peter 2:5 is actually likening us to the temple, not so much to Jerusalem as a whole. But it's not strange for the church to be depicted as the temple or as Jerusalem or as Israel or in many other things. But that we are, in our efforts, seeking to see the rubble and the trash that's come into the church removed and have the church built on its old foundations would be a reasonable way to apply the story of Nehemiah to our own case. Because he comes at a time where the city has been broken down by enemies and the place is just covered with rubble. It's really difficult for them to clean the mess before they even build afterwards. But they have to remove the trash so that they can build the walls as they once were again. And it would seem to me, I don't think not a great stretch, to say that our task in the church is to recognize how much rubble there is of the destruction that's taken place in the intervening centuries since Christ was here, since the apostles died. How much of what they taught has been neglected, has been lost, maybe not lost entirely, but it's not practiced in the institutional churches. Certainly during the Middle Ages, the church was almost entirely full of human traditions and neglect of the gospel, neglect of the scriptures, and the Reformation began to recover some of that. Luther and Calvin and others sought to recover some of the early truths of Christianity that existed before the Roman Catholic movement had brought in all their traditions, but even the Reformation didn't get rid of all the traditions. We see that they still taught some of the Catholic traditions. They didn't see everything. And so the building or the rebuilding of the church goes on. And its activity is seen in a return to scriptural norms. And we all have something to do with that. Some, perhaps people who teach, people in a position like my own, have a real advantage in that we can actually present, the biblical truth in as we're doing here, teaching through the scriptures, verse by verse. But even those who are not teachers, nonetheless, have a role to play. In Israel, in Jerusalem, in Nehemiah's day, we see that everybody had a role to play. Even some of the women were involved in the work of the building of the walls. And they each worked in their own separate location. Each one had its own task. Just like the body of Christ is made up of many members, each has a separate gift, a separate task. But all in all, the building up of the body of Christ is the goal. That God has given some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the building up. The edification. The word edify means to build up a building. Edifice is a building. And edify means to build up like you build a building up. And the purpose of all the gifts that God has given is for the edification, the building up of the church. So Nehemiah's work, I believe, is a foreshadowing of the work that the church has before it even today. Well, let's get into Nehemiah chapter 1 then. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month of Chislev, which is the 9th month of Jewish calendar, in the 20th year, apparently the 20th year of Artaxerxes, as I was in Shushan, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. Now, he apparently had on his heart the holy city, even though he himself was removed, as far as he knew, permanently removed from it. He had a position that's hard to get into in the king's court and even harder to get out of. If the king lets you into his court and hires you into this position, well, it's a command performance. You really don't just walk away and say, I've found a better offer. You don't get another job when the king has assigned you to something. And so, in all likelihood, Nehemiah felt like he'd never be able to go to Jerusalem, but he was certainly concerned about what was going on there in their holy city. And so when people would come back visiting from there, he would inquire, say, how things going there? And the report he got was not positive. They said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments, please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sin of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name, and to let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now, it seems that Nehemiah at this point has decided that he cannot rest content in Persia, in his comfortable place, while his brethren are in great distress, and while things are lying in such disarray in Jerusalem. And he's actually committed himself at this point, obviously, to go back. He doesn't say so in his prayer, but it's obvious. He's saying, grant me favor in the sight of this man. Now this man is Artaxerxes, the king. And what favor is he asking? Well, it's obvious. We will find in the next chapter, the king asked him, what would you like me to do? He says, send me back there to do this. So at this point, Nehemiah has got a vision from God to go back himself to leave the position in the palace and to go back and get his hands dirty and work and sweat with the people of God to try to get the thing rectified and restored in Jerusalem that is undone. And so he offers this prayer that God will move the heart of the king. That's what he's actually praying. Now he starts out by confessing the sins of the people and of himself, but also reciting to God the promises that God had made, that if his people are driven away to far lands, if they turn to him, that he'll restore them. And so Nehemiah's idea is that in this case, the way he hopes for the Lord to restore them is by Nehemiah's agency, by Nehemiah being free to go and become a leader there. And so he's praying he's asking largely, he's asking a big thing, especially in view of the fact that his master Artaxerxes was the one who some years earlier had written a letter calling a halt to the building of the walls of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's building project was under an interdict from the king for how many years we don't know, but for some period of time. And now Nehemiah is actually asking him to lift that interdict and to send Nehemiah to help build the walls. It's a very huge change that he's asking the king to make, and so he's asking God to move on the heart of the king and to give him mercy in the man's sight. You know, from this prayer, which is, not even a chapter long, we see a number of valuable lessons about intercessory prayer. Moses also prayed for the children of Israel when they made the golden calf, and he managed to get God's mercy to be given toward them so that he didn't destroy them. Ezra also interceded in the book of Ezra, and Daniel interceded in Daniel chapter 9 for the people. And in these various instances of intercessory prayer, we can learn many things about what it is. Now, first of all, what is intercessory prayer? Intercession means to stand in between and plead. To stand between a guilty party and the judge, and to plead on behalf of the guilty. That's what intercede means. And so intercessory prayer just means that you stand before God on behalf of somebody else. Now there's other kinds of prayer besides intercession. Supplication is simply where you present to God your concerns that are your own concerns. Things that are on your heart, but not necessarily praying for mercy to be shown to somebody else. When you pray for the soul of somebody else who's not you, you are interceding for them. And Moses interceded for Israel. Abraham interceded even for Sodom, as you may recall. And God actually agreed to spare Sodom if he could find 10 righteous in the city, which is what Abraham asked. And here we have intercessory prayer from Nehemiah. And there's a number of things that we might learn from it. I could see 8 things in this prayer that might be instructive to us if we hope to be intercessors of this kind. His prayer was obviously effective, as we shall see. God answered this prayer and was apparently pleased with it. One of the first things we see is that his prayer came from a broken heart. He says in verse 4, it was, when I heard these words, I mourned for many days. I fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. This man wasn't sending up a light and painless prayer. He was grieved deeply. His heart was broken over the condition of Jerusalem. And it was days of grief that he experienced over this. Actually, it turns out months. Apparently 4 months of grief before he actually had the opportunity to ask the favor of the king. And so this man's heart was broken. He had sympathy with the cause of God in this matter. And, a prayer that doesn't have any passion, doesn't have any empathy or sympathy with God's concerns, but it's just offered routinely, is probably not going to be as effective as one that comes poured forth from a broken heart. A second thing we see about it is he based his prayer on God's revealed character. In verse 5, he says, you are the one who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and who observe your commandments. So he says, you're a covenant-keeping God. That's who you are. It's because of that that I feel I can make a request like this to you. Because you're faithful. And to make our appeal based on the kind of God that we're approaching is another aspect of this prayer, which is no doubt worthy of emulation. A third aspect is it was not at all a self-righteous prayer. He wasn't standing above the sinners and saying, those rotten sinners. He was saying, I have sinned, my father's house have sinned, we have sinned. I'm speaking to you about the sins of Israel, your servants, and I confess our sins against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. This is, of course, verses 6 and 7. He speaks this way. Another thing is that he seems to be concerned about God's interest rather than a selfish interest of his own. It's God's interest. It didn't have any particular impact on Nehemiah's well-being, what went on in Jerusalem. He was comfortable. He was wealthy. He had a great job. And he was probably good at it. It was kind of a gravy job, I would imagine. Except in times when people are trying to poison the king, his position would be a rather secure and comfortable life. And yet he was concerned about God's people, whom he continually referred to as your servants. He even referred to himself as your servant frequently. But in verse 6, he speaks of Israel as your servants. And in verse 10, again, he says, now these people are your servants and your people. In other words, this is your concern. These people are your servants. They're not my servants. This is not my problem. This is your problem. And to be motivated by a concern for God's interests, for his own servants and for his own reputation, his own covenant, and so forth, is what's really on Nehemiah's heart. A fifth aspect of his prayer was persistent. It lasted for days. And he prayed night and day, as he says in verse 6. He says, hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now day and night. And in verse 4 we saw that it was for many days. So it was a persistent prayer. Another aspect, a sixth aspect, is that it was built, his case was built on God's promises. In verses 8 and 9, he says, remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant. And it's not just commandment, but the promise was attached to that in verse 9. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast to the farthest part of heavens, yet I will gather them from there. So this is a promise that God made. And he's reminding God of his promises. Now, the Bible nowhere tells us to claim the promises, which is a very common expression among Christians. Got to claim the promises. There's no place in the Bible that says to claim the promises. And sometimes people claiming promises sound like they're trying to order God around and trying to twist his arm. But actually, to just remind God, this is the reason I'm praying. This is the reason I have confidence that my prayer will be heard, because you've made certain promises along the lines of what I'm asking. I'm not being presumptuous, in other words. I'm not just making up my own agenda and asking you to sign your name to it, God. I'm asking you to do the thing that you yourself have expressed a commitment to do. I'm praying according to your will that you've expressed in your promises. And so he quotes to God those promises. Seventh, the focus he focuses on God's own concern for his own purposes. I guess there's a sense in which this is similar to number 4. But in verse 10, he says, these are your servants, your people whom you've redeemed. This is your problem, God. I guess it's not very different than number 4. And then number 8, he volunteered to be a change agent, to be part of the solution to the problem he's praying for. It's easy to pray for things to happen in the world, but then to say, and here am I, send me, is the next step. To say, I'm willing to put my money where my mouth is. It shows sincerity, not only his fasting and his persistent praying, but his volunteering. He's praying for something to happen, and then he says, and here am I, send me. Please give me mercy in the sight of this man and others. Grant me the favor I'm hoping to have, which is that I'll be released to go and serve in the arena where I see the need. In Matthew chapter 9, at the end of Matthew chapter 9, Jesus said to his disciples in verse 37 and 38, Matthew 9:37, Jesus said to the disciples, "The harvest truly is plentiful and the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out more laborers into his harvest." So he first tells his disciples to pray that God will send more laborers. Then look at chapter 10, verse 1. "And when he had called his 12 disciples to him, he gave them power over unclean spirits to cast them out, to heal all kinds of disease, etc. And he sent them out." See, he sends them out 2 by 2 in this short-term outreach. But notice he said, "I want you to pray that God will send more laborers. And by the way, I'm sending you. You're going to be the answer to your own prayers." And that's what Nehemiah was saying. I want to be the answer to my own prayer. I want you to use me. I'm willing to leave my position, my comfort zone, and go out and do the thing that will help promote the thing I'm asking you to do. So that I'm willing to be a laborer together with God in this matter, and not just sit comfortably at home and pray for things to happen in a faraway place. When you intercede for another person, you should be willing, if God leads, to send you to that person, or to do whatever it is needs to be done to see your own prayers answered. Okay, now chapter 2. "And it came to pass in the month of Nisan," which would be the probably about, I guess that'd be about 3 or 4 months later. About 4 months later, because it was the 9th month when he first got this news, and it was now the first month. Nisan was the first month of the Jewish calendar, the religious calendar. So that would be 4 months later, essentially. "In the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before." It was actually not safe to be sad in the king's presence. In the book of Esther, chapter 4 and verse 2, we read that Mordecai was fasting and mourning, but he didn't dare go into the gates of the king's quarters, because you do not dare go before the king mourning. This is chapter 4 of Esther, and verse 2. Well, Esther 4, verses 1 and 2. "When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the square in front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth." The idea was that the king of Persia wanted to have a happy environment. To have someone moping around, depressed, kind of rains on the parade. And he didn't like that kind of gloom in his presence. When people are mourning, they don't show it around the king. You put on a happy face around the king, because he wants to have a happy world. He wants to have a happy environment. And so he said here at the end of verse 1 of chapter 2, "I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart.' Then I became dreadfully afraid." He wasn't sure if this was going to go badly for him, because he had, although he'd been sad and mourning and praying for 4 months, on this particular day, he apparently was not able to conceal his grief as he had all along. Whenever he'd go before the king, he'd put on a happy face, even though he wasn't happy. This time, his grief of heart was apparently particularly crushing, and he was not able to put on a happy face. And when he noticed that the king saw that he was that he was sad, it scared him, because he wasn't sure if he was going to get in trouble now. "I was dreadfully afraid, and I said to the king, 'May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad, when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire?'" Now, he doesn't mention Jerusalem by name. He mentions, my ancestral home, where my father's tombs are, perhaps hoping to get a little bit of sympathy from the king. The word Jerusalem might have been a bad word, or might at least not have had completely good connotations, in view of the fact that the king had received reports from men much earlier telling him that there was rebellion in Jerusalem and that they wanted to turn against the king. But he just refers to it as the place of my father's tombs. Then the king said to me, what do you request? So here's his open door. Here's his opportunity. And he realizes it's opportunity. He doesn't just speak, he first prays. He says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. Now we don't read what he prayed, but he apparently offered up silent prayer that God would give him favor and the right manner of speaking to the king to get what he's hoping for. And here we see for the first time Nehemiah's spontaneous prayer life, which is illustrated for us at least 10 times in the book. At least 10 times we have him praying spontaneously. Now, the man is a practical man in a political position, but he's a spiritual man. He knows how to pray. He can pray prevailing intercessory prayers over a prolonged time, as he was doing, as chapter 1 tells us. But we see through the rest of the book that he's also able to just talk to God through the day. It reminds me of Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof, you know, how that he, from time to time he would just kind of turn his eyes up and make some kind of comment to God. In that case it was sometimes a snide comment, but he talked to God as if he was just somebody there with him. Somebody that he had something to say to and said it off the top of his head. And Nehemiah talks that way too, though not snidely. He talks as if he's aware that God is paying attention at all times and that God has all the concerns he has. I mean, I have 10 examples of this. I won't show them all to you now, but you could look at it, just what I'm talking about. Chapter 4, verse 9 is an example. Actually, verses 4 and 5 also in chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 4 says, hear, O our God, for we are despised, and turn their reproach on their own heads. In chapter 4, verse 9, he says, nevertheless we made our prayer to God, which I believe was spontaneous. In chapter 5, verse 19, he says, remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. In chapter 6, verse 9, at the end of verse 9, he says, now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. And in chapter 6, verse 14, my God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat, according to these their works, and the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. So he just kind of spontaneously prays as things come to his mind that he is concerned about. There's 3 such prayers at the very end of the book in chapter 13. Verse 14 it says, remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his services. And in the same chapter, at the end of verse 22, remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. The same chapter, verse 29, remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. And then the very last line in the book in verse 31, remember me, O my God, for good. So this man, we probably have his prayer journal here, for the most part, in his memoirs. And he continually is sending up timely prayers, spontaneously as they seem appropriate. And so the king says, what do you request? He says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. In this case, the actual prayer he prayed is not recorded. And he says, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, how long will your journey be? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Now it doesn't tell us here what the time was, but in chapter 13 and verse 6, we are told that he had gone back to Persia. It says in chapter 13, verse 6, it says, during all this time I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. So he left in the 20th year and returned in the 32nd year, which means he spent about 12 years in Jerusalem. And apparently he asked for a leave of absence for 12 years. That's a lengthy absence. The king would have to find another cupbearer Of course, he may have had several cupbearers and who were on a rotation, so it was still an inconvenience to the king that was being asked, and yet Nehemiah had favor in his sight due to God, and answering his prayer. He says in verse 7, "Furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river," that's beyond the Euphrates, to the west of the Euphrates, "that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah." Now, some of these governors to the west of the river would be those who had written letters to Artaxerxes previously, complaining about the Jews and influencing him to call off the building project. So now he says, I need letters from you to these people saying that it's okay what I'm doing. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. This expression, according to the hand of God, or the good hand of God, is found quite a few times in Ezra. Actually 6 times in Ezra. Ezra spoke about how things prospered that he attempted because of the good hand of God that was upon him. Emphasis on the sovereignty of God and the intervention of God and God's assistance is very strong in books of Ezra and Nehemiah. We'll see that again later on when it says that a little later on when the enemies were really unhappy with him. It says in chapter 6, verse 16, "It happened when all our enemies heard of it," that's when the wall was completed, "and all the nations around us saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that the work was done by our God." So Ezra and Nehemiah both are continually reminding us that it's God's hand, it's God's work that's getting these things done. They're not taking credit for themselves. Now the king's forest mentioned in verse 8, nobody knows exactly where that might have been, but it's very probable